Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining today's presentation. Today we have Matthew Roche, Senior Program Manager for Microsoft, speaking on Power BI Data Flows 201, Beyond the Basics. Matthew, without wasting any time, I'll give you the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jason. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is awesome to be with you guys today. As Jason mentioned, I'm a program manager on the Power BI team at Microsoft. For those of you who are not familiar with me, I've been with Microsoft for around 10 years. I've worked on Power BI, Azure Data Catalog, SQL Server Integration Services, Master Data Services, and Data Quality Services. And for the 10 or 15 years before I joined Microsoft, I was a data warehousing and ETL consultant. So I've had over my career a lot of opportunities to look at the space that data flows play in from lots of different angles. Really excited about this technology, and I'm very excited to share today's session with you. We are focusing on non-introductory data flow scenarios today, looking specifically at some of the Azure integration that's under the hood. But I do want to begin just to make sure we're all on the same page by looking at data flows from an introductory perspective, specifically looking at them in three different ways. This is a way for, it's essentially a way for us to get aligned and to get our headspace together before we look at some of those underlying details. We won't spend a ton of time here, but we'll use this as sort of laying the groundwork, and we'll jump into a first demo to show an end-to-end view of data flows that we'll then build on top of as we move forward. So when I think about data flows in Power BI, I think about them in three primary different ways. The first and probably the most significant way that I think about data flows is that they are a part of the evolution of BI, or an evolution of the self-service BI pattern. So I've been around long enough to remember back when having data to work with, having an application that developed data was a relatively new thing. So back in the late 70s and early 80s, we would have these OLTP systems, so some app, some transactional system that had its own data, and we had the desire to build more reports or dashboards or other visualizations on top of that. And back when I was your age, having the ability to do visualizations and to work with data outside of the application that developed it, that was pretty cool. And having this ability over time, we also had more of these transactional applications, and customers or clients wanted the ability to get information from multiple source systems into the same reports to get a better view of their business. This is where the data warehouse, and specifically the data warehouse pattern, arose. Don't think specifically about the relational data warehouse as a technology, because if we think about the quote-unquote modern data warehouse pattern that has emerged over the last 5 or 10 years, we also see the very different data lake technology, that big data technology, implementing a lot of the same patterns, where this data warehouse pattern, or the data warehouse tier in our architecture, is here to solve a set of common, well-known or well-understood problems. We use the data warehouse tier for staging, for cleansing, for enrichment, for standardization, because the source systems, each one of these has overlap with the others. There's customer data, there's product data, there's these common business entities that are represented in most business systems, but they're represented in different ways with a different level of granularity, different details, and so on. And in order to do reporting or other analytics on top of that data, you need a common standardized view. This is where the data warehouse as a pattern or as a set of capabilities comes in. And of course, in order to get the data from sources A, B, and C, to get them ready for reports X, Y, and Z, we need some way to extract, transform, and load that data. So along with the data warehouse pattern, we have the ETL subsystem, or the data preparation tools, that will get the data from where it starts out into this location for downstream processing. And once we have this data in the data warehouse, invariably we end up with more and more people doing more and more reporting. And this is where the technology itself, this is where the limitations of the platform come in, because neither the data lake nor the relational data warehouse is really optimized for a lot of these high volume interactive ad hoc queries. So state of the art, I don't know, 20 or 25 years ago, we also got the analytics model. So this could be analysis services, multidimensional or tabular. It could be lots of other in-memory optimized technologies here. But we have this OLAP model that is designed specifically for this interactive analytics, different storage, different technology for different usage patterns for that data. And the real interesting evolution, or the way that the BI platform has evolved in the last 5 to 10 years, has not been on net new capabilities as much as it has been on enabling less technical users to build different parts of this end-to-end architecture. If you look at the box that's here labeled Self-Service BI, this is where most self-service BI tools, whether it's Power BI or Tableau or QlikView or MicroStrategy or the like, most of them have focused on the visualization, the reporting and the dashboarding, and some tools, including Power BI, also include this self-service data modeling component. Power BI as well has a capability for self-service data preparation through Power Query. But before data flows, there were two primary patterns that we would see, or that I would see with the customers that I work with. The first one is that the self-service BI users would be primarily getting their data from the centrally managed IT developed data warehouse or data lake, and that tabular model that they were developing for their Power BI data set in their PBIX file would just be coming from this source. And if they needed additional data added, a new dimension or a new attribute for an existing dimension, they would need to go to IT, and again, they would be blocked, sort of defeating the self-service part. The other pattern is when they see a gap, when they need a new measure or a new attribute or a new dimension, they would go back to either the original source systems or some new source system to mash up that data. And this would unblock them from their dependency on the IT schedule, but it would also reintroduce at one scale or another, it would reintroduce the problems that the data warehousing pattern would introduce, or it would reintroduce the problems that the data warehousing pattern was designed to solve. So with data flows use the same self-service data preparation capabilities that Power BI users are familiar with in Power Query, but because of the way that they store their data, it's not simply defining a new table in our analytics model. It's actually creating files and folders. We'll talk more about those details later on in the session, but it's creating files and folders in Azure storage behind the scenes, and it's implementing this data warehouse pattern that conforms or better conforms with the best practices for an end-to-end BI application. I don't like using the term self-service data warehousing because data warehousing has a lot more connotations to it than what most self-service users will be capable of delivering. But if you think about data flows as closing that gap to align better with best practices through self-service data preparation as part of an integrated platform, that is a great way to think about data flows. The second way that I think about data flows is sort of like the most obvious one. Data flows are another type of object or artifact inside of the Power BI service. If you're familiar with Power BI, you know that you build your reports and your dashboards on top of data sets, and that data sets get their data from some set of data sources. It could be SQL Server, it could be Oracle, it could be text files, it could be a REST API. There's a huge connectivity stack and ecosystem that it can use. In this context, data flows are another data source that a data set can get its data from. I need to emphasize, because even for non-introductory sessions, this is a question that usually comes up. Yes, you do still need data sets. Data sets continue to be that analytics model that reports and dashboards are built on. Data flows simply serve as another place where data sets can get their data from, just like an IT-delivered data warehouse in the end-to-end flow. Another thing that I like to emphasize is that both data sets and data flows are self-service artifacts that are built on top of robust enterprise technology. If you're familiar with the power of Power BI, you know that a data set is really just an analysis services tabular model that is managed by the Power BI service. There are a few differences in functionality, but Microsoft has built Power BI on top of its decades-long investment in this tabular technology, which gives data sets their power. Similarly, data flows in Power BI are a self-service wrapper on top of a technology known as CDM folders in Azure Storage behind the scenes. So an end user building a data set never needs to know, and probably never will know, that they're actually building a tabular model. An end user building a data flow never needs to know, and will probably never know, that they're building CDM folders in Azure under the hood. But through this self-service BI capabilities, we're able to use that underlying Azure storage through the familiar self-service tools that Power BI users already know, specifically Power Query. And as you can probably guess, we'll come back and we'll look at this side of data flows much closer after the demo. The third way that I like to introduce or to think about data flows is that data flows are like Excel. And this one is a conceptual shift from the other two. The other two were a little bit more technology focused. This one is more conceptual. If you think about Excel and Excel workbooks, a given cell inside a workbook can contain either a value or a formula. And if it contains a formula, then that formula references other cells or ranges of cells in this workbook, one sheet or another, or in a different external workbook. And because both the data and the relationships, the references, are managed by Excel, Excel has this authoritative view of all of the data lineage because of those formulas. Anytime that you update a value in one cell, any formula that depends on it, either directly or indirectly, will automatically update to reflect that change. Now, I'm putting this in air quotes, even though I'm not sharing my my webcast or my webcam here, but I'm putting this in air quotes. This magical "it just works" perspective for Excel is not how enterprise ETL has ever worked. Building one package is relatively simple. Orchestrating dozens of packages to work successfully regardless of what's happening is more of the advanced task. And data flows, because of their Excel-like nature, make a lot of this complexity go away. So when we pull in data from outside of the system, so here on the slide, we have some data sources that live outside of Power BI. When we pull those into Power BI, these two data flows, which represent our staging layer, they need to be explicitly refreshed, either manually or programmatically or on a schedule, and it could be incremental or a full refresh, but we need to pull the data into the system, and each data flow has its own refresh schedule, and this allows us to pull in data that matches up with the load window or batch processing window, the availability and performance characteristics of those external source systems. But once the data is in Power BI, it's in these data flow entities. Any downstream entities, so these data flows have entities that reference the upstream entities. Anytime that the upstream ones, like the upstream cells or ranges in Excel, are updated, the downstream entities will automatically refresh in a predictable and transactionally consistent manner without any user interaction being required, which means that when a data flow that is often these source or staging data flows are created by IT, when they're refreshed on their schedule, any data flows that depend on them will automatically refresh and will be as current as is possible. the Excel-like nature here, the analogy actually goes deeper. Just as a given cell in Excel can contain a formula, every entity in a Power BI data flow is defined by its formula. And the formula is an M query or Power Query query, but the analogy holds up very strongly, especially when you consider that Power BI has a dependency engine or calculation engine that understands all of the relationships between all of the data flows and uses that to keep everything current. So without spending too much more time here, let's come into a quick demo. I actually want to build up this end-to-end view just using Power BI so that we can see how everything fits together. So to begin with, I've already created this past BI. It should be VC, but I guess it's VS today. But we've got a workspace to work with. I will emphasize that this is a workspace that is backed by premium content. Data flows are not a premium only feature, but I will be using those Excel-like composable ETL capabilities with linked and computed entities. That is a premium only feature, so just be aware there. I'm going to start off by saying create data flow, and I'm going to pull in data to begin with from a text file that's stored in Azure Storage. So I'm just going to build up a few quick things just to show that end-to-end experience. I'll paste in that URL. For those of you who are following along at home, I have a multi-monitor setup, and I have a text file with my URLs and connection information on a screen that I'm not sharing. So here I start off with my simple query. Let's say that we will use our first row as headers. So this will both promote the headers, and in a recent addition to Power Query Online, it will also automatically detect and change the column types. Be aware that the environment that I'm using is a few weeks ahead of our public environment, so if you don't see this particular functionality today, this is a sneak peek at what's coming. We'll call this promotions. So we pull in our promotion data. So we've got a product ID, we've got a promotion ID, we've got an account ID, we've got a bunch of other information. Let us simply say save and close. We'll do some quick validation, or the service does quick validation. We will give this a name. And when prompted, we will say, yes, we will refresh this. So we've created the world's simplest data flow. We'll say no for that. I assume that that was because I had been playing around beforehand and may have, come on, let us see what we have, We'll come back here, we'll come to data flows, and let me just make sure that it did refresh successfully. Excellent. So not sure what's going on there. I will blame as well my early environment. This is a pre-production environment here that I like to use for my demos. So I will move to create a second data flow inside the same workspace. So I will say create data flow. For this one, I am going to pull in data from an Azure SQL DB database. So I will say add new. We'll choose SQL. We'll put in our information. I've got my credentials cached, so I'll say next. I've got 3 different tables that I will pull in information from. Because this is a staging data flow, so we're basically just getting the information into the system so we can work with it later. We don't want to do a ton of transformation, but I will rename this to be a little bit more descriptive. We'll call it calls per account per day. Again, we will save and close. Again, the service will validate the queries to ensure that they will be able to be refreshed. We do as much of this validation up front as possible to avoid unpleasant surprises. We will call this one call log staging, because this is about which accounts and which calls we are going out and calling related to a promotion. I will refresh this one as well. And if we come back and we look at our data flow, you will see that the data flow, or sorry, the workspace has two different data flows in it. If we look at this in the diagram view and turn on data sources, you can see that we have this promotion staging data flow that pulls in data from a text file or text file data. We have a call log staging data flow that pulls in data from Azure SQL DB. Let's add a third data flow here. And for this one, instead of pulling in data from external sources, I'm going to choose to add linked entities, which is that composable Excel-like ETL scenario. I will stay authenticated to the Power BI service. Basically, when we say linked entities, what we're really saying is use Power BI data flows as our data source. I will come back here to pull in data from entities in the two data flows that I had already created. Let's do this and this. So we've got calls per account per day. We've got promotions. We will choose next. You'll notice that each one of these has the little link next to it. This linked entity is for all intents and purposes a pointer to the entity where it already lives in storage. We are not duplicating the data. We're not copying anything. We're simply pointing to it. And the next thing that I want to do is to say to merge queries as new. So I will say promotions on the left, calls per account per day on the right. We've got account ID to join it on. And once the merge is complete, I will scroll over to the right, expand out my calls per account per day. We will get that guy out of the way. We don't want account ID to show up twice. We don't want the original column names. And now we've got our data. So this will be calls by account by promotion. I will choose save and close, and we'll go back and we will take a look at how our workspace looks. I'll say promotions and calls. We're not going to refresh now. Instead, what we want to do is we want to look at the workspace, and we can see that because Power BI has this authoritative relationship view, because each entity is defined by a Power Query, we can now display that graphically as well. And if any of the upstream entities are refreshed, so if I say refresh now for this, we will first see the upstream data flow spin and then the downstream one as well, because that first data flow will automatically start to refresh. And I want to do one additional thing before we move on. So I am going to say, actually come back here. So you notice that in our downstream entity, we have promotions and calls. I want to add some additional business data to this. I need information about the customers that we're calling for these accounts. So when I choose add entities, I will choose Power BI data flows as my source. So notice this is the same experience, but we started it through a slightly different path in the user experience. And I'm going to come into this separate workspace. I have an AdventureWorks workspace with an AdventureWorks sales staging data flow inside it. And I want to pull in information about the customers, the products in categories, by sales order header and detail. I want to get information about who's actually buying what during these promotions. And this information is already part of this data flow. I'm not going to do any additional transformation. I'm simply going to leave this here. So when I choose save and close, the validation here is going to take a little bit longer because we've added a larger number of entities. I am not going to choose refresh now either, but what I will do, let me zoom out just a little bit, is to show that we have, in addition to the the linked entities going to other data flows inside my same workspace. I also have linked entities that are pointing to data flows in an external workspace. And when any of these is refreshed, this one will automatically refresh because of the dependencies that the Power BI service maintains. Now, in our next demo, we're going to come and look at some of the things that were created under the hood or behind the scenes as we went through this work. But before we do that, let's actually come back in and review what we've just done. As a self-service user, so as a Power Query user who is not necessarily technical, I might be a finance analyst, I might be a business guy, I have connected to data using the familiar Power Query tools that I'm already used to working with, and I've created something that sits in this logical tier. I've created these reusable data entities, and when any of these, so if we think about this upstream one, when any of these upstream ones are refreshed on either my schedule, on an IT schedule, or when I refresh them manually myself, this more complex one, this thing that I want to use as my data source for building reports or to allow my colleagues to use to build reports, that will automatically refresh as well without my needing to do any sort of scheduling, orchestration, or the like. And when I come into Power BI Desktop, let me get this guy on the screen here, and I say get data from Power BI data flows as my data source. Once I connect, I will be able to see, drum roll here, I'll let this guy load. Hopefully it shows up on the right monitor. Come. There we go. So we'll be able to see the workspaces. So this is a list of all of the workspaces that contain data flows that I have permissions to access. So I will expand this out. I will come down to this promotions and calls because this is where I have the data that I want to work with. And here I can see all of the entities that I defined, and they will appear as strongly typed tables for any Power BI desktop user that has permissions to access them. So I can select them. I can get the preview just like I would with any other data source, and I can then choose either to load or to edit if I want to do additional transformations and mashups using Power Query in Power BI Desktop. And this is really, and notice Power Query is opening on one of my non-shared displays. There we go. But this is showing how those data flows and the entities that they contain that I've created as a business user can be used as a data source by other Power BI desktop users. So what does this mean for Azure integration? How does this Azure integration behind the scenes actually work? What we're doing when we create a data flow is we're creating a CDM folder, which is literally a folder full of files in Azure Storage. The naming convention of the structure is that there will be a root folder for Power BI. There will be a subfolder for each workspace, a subfolder for each data flow, and then a subfolder for each entity. And each entity will have one or more text files. So the storage is CSV files in Azure. There will be one or more text files per entity. If we define a simple entity with no partitioning, so there's no incremental refresh setup, there will be one-to-one mapping between an entity and its storage. If you do have incremental refresh or other partitioning logic that you've set up, there will be one text file per partition. It's a very common pattern that you see in big data storage. And because the data is stored in Azure, this enables other integration with other Azure services. Now, let me draw another parallel here. Do you remember how I mentioned that a data set is really just an analysis services tabular model that is managed by the Power BI service? So another way to think about this is that until very recently, we opened up the XMLA endpoint for connecting to Power BI datasets as tabular models. It meant that Power BI, the service, was the only reader and the only writer for those tabular models. So even though the technology behind the scenes was the same, we didn't expose it for consumption. Dataflows follows a similar pattern. The default configuration is that Power BI Dataflows will use storage that is managed by the Power BI service, and even though it is stored in Azure, nobody else, we'll draw an X here, so no other service can read from it. So Power BI by default is the only writer and the only reader for the CDM folders that it creates. And the emphasis here is on having this low code or no code experience where a business analyst or other Power BI user can create these reusable entities, but it's still just a Power BI thing. The real power comes from using an organizational data lake resource to tell Power BI, instead of writing to your own internal storage or the Azure storage that you manage, write Dataflows data to my storage, to this storage account in my subscription, that I will get billed for, that my Azure team will get billed for. And once that happens, any other Azure service that is authorized to read from that folder, to read those files, can use the CDM folders as an input for their processing, and also can write to CDM folders to make that data available for Power BI users as well. Setting up this, notice that the acronym here, the Bring Your Own Storage Account, BYOSA. This particular slide was created by the engineers that built this functionality. So if you look at it closely, it's very obvious this is not a marketing slide. So this Bring Your Own Storage Account configuration requires 3 different steps to make it work end to end. The first step is a one-time only configuration by a Power BI global administrator, where he or she will go into the tenant settings to say, this is the storage account that I will use for the Power BI service. The first step is actually to set up the Azure storage account. The configuration steps are a little fiddly. You need to create a specific folder and grant specific permissions to it. I'm not going to try to do that today, or I'm not going to do that today, I should say, because it's a one-time step, but it's well documented, and if you follow the documentation, it's relatively easy. But you're essentially just creating an Azure subscription, a storage resource that is set up to be an ADLS Gen 2 resource. You grant permissions to the service identities that are used by the Power BI service for your tenant. And then once that's done, you make a one-time change in your tenant configuration settings to say, this is the storage account that Dataflows can use. Once this is done, there is an on-off switch to say, allow workspace admins to use this storage account for their data flows. And when this is done, individual workspace admins can then set up new workspaces to use that storage. So as we move forward down the flow, the second path, or the second swim lane here, is that for a Power BI workspace admin, it begins with creating a new V2 workspace. And this V2 workspace is that modern workspace experience that recently went GA. It must be a V2 workspace for this Azure integration to work. Some Dataflows capabilities will work in the older V1 workspaces, but all of the interesting scenarios like Azure integration and the linked and computed entities do require a V2 workspace. So when you're creating the workspace, you will have an option during creation to say, use my organizational Azure storage. And when you then go through the standard flow and you create and refresh a data flow, that refresh operation is going to write the data into ADLS storage, into your ADLS storage account instead of into the Azure storage that is managed by Power BI. So instead of the default storage. And from this point on, once an authorized developer or data scientist works with the data that is in that CDM folder, they can then use that as an input into any other Azure-based processing that they want. So not only is the CDM folder very accessible and transparent, so it is CSV files with a JSON file for its metadata. There are also libraries and SDKs for working with CDM folders for most environments, and this experience will only get better over time. There are a couple things that I do need to emphasize here, and the limitations that I'm about to emphasize will go away in the near future. This Azure integration is still in public preview, even though data flows are now generally available. This Azure-specific set of capabilities is still in preview, and these are preview limitations that I'm about to describe. So when you create a data flow using your organizational account, that data flow is only accessible by the workspace administrator, so specifically by the user that created and refreshed the data flow. This means that if you grant other users access to your workspace, where normally this would grant them access to the data flows in the workspace as well, and they try to use those data flows as a source, they will receive an error. They are not authorized. During preview, in addition to granting permissions inside of Power BI, you also need to grant permissions to those users or groups in Azure on the CDM folder basis. So you actually need to go into Azure Storage Explorer or the Azure portal and grant those users permissions to access the files and folders. And again, I do want to emphasize that is a preview limitation that will go away. So the end-to-end flow, you create that storage account, you create an ADLS Gen 2 resource inside it, you attach that to Power BI. You do need to use your own Azure subscription. So this is a way for you to easily put more data into Azure, but the storage and the any additional fees will come from that Azure subscription. It's also worth mentioning that once you configure that storage location, you can't change it for that workspace. So if you have data flows in a workspace, you can't change the location, and it's relatively easy to tear down and set back up, but that's a limitation that I hadn't mentioned earlier. So the other side of the Azure story is something that we call external data flows, or attaching external CDM folders. So that first path, the bring your own storage account path, has Power BI be the writer and other Azure services be the reader. This other scenario is taking advantage of the fact that any Azure service can also write to or create its own CDM folders. And this is something that we're working to add to Dynamics in the future as well. So other services, whether it's a Microsoft service or your code or some third party, can write to CDM folders. And that CDM folder can be attached as a new data flow into a Power BI workspace, which means that other Power BI users can build on top of it, either referencing it in their data flows or building on top of it in Power BI Desktop. And we'll look at both of these when we get into, here we go, into the demo. So let me show a little bit behind the scenes. So we have started off looking at a workspace in sort of an analyst perspective, but we also want to look at what was necessary to be done before we created that demo. So here I'm in the admin portal. So for this environment, I am a tenant administrator, and I can see if I, all right, so I will not zoom. I will assume that everyone can see what I can see, but I will find my mouse. So here under data flow settings, under this data flow storage preview account, I've made this one-time change to configure this specific storage account for my Power BI tenant. The other thing that I've done is I've configured to allow workspace administrators to assign their workspaces to this storage account, and this will enable anyone who is creating a new workspace to write to this storage instead of to the built-in storage. Now, I didn't mention this as I was working in this pre-created workspace, but if I look at the settings here, so this is the workspace level settings for the workspace that we used for our first demo. As I already mentioned, this is the premium capacity that I'm using, but B, when I created the workspace, I chose to turn on this data flow storage. Notice that it can't be changed because there are data flows here, but this is that one-time switch that we need to set. And if I had started off by saying create an app workspace, hidden down here in the advanced settings, just where we have the ability to enable a dedicated premium capacity if we have permissions to use one. Here as well, we have that ability to turn on or to leave off. It defaults to off because it's still in preview, that data flow storage. And this as well will emphasize that there are, I love the understatement here, data flow permission management may be affected. So this is referencing that limitation, that preview limitation around setting permissions that we talked about earlier. If you click on the Learn More link, it will take you to a documentation page that goes into the details. The other thing that I haven't mentioned out loud yet is that those composable ETL scenarios where the downstream entities automatically refresh through the linked and computed entities, those only work if the upstream and downstream entities are in the same storage account. So if you have one workspace that is in the Power BI managed storage and another workspace that is in your organizational storage, you will not be able to use those Excel-like composable ETL capabilities to create that automatic refresh scenario. The other thing that I should mention as well is that the writing to your organizational Azure account is not a premium feature. I think that I mentioned this, but I want to emphasize it as well. Even though that the linked and computed entities is, using your organizational Azure account is not. So let me do this one last time. So the last thing that I want to do is to show the other side of the Azure integration by attaching a CDM folder. And this is the third path to create a data flow. We already began one data flow by defining our new entities and building our own queries. We defined one by linking to other entities. If we choose this create and attach, you'll notice that this is a much simpler path. All that we're being prompted for here is a name and a path to a CDM folder. I'm going to use this as my jumping off point to look at what's been going on behind the scenes as we've been creating these things in Power BI. So let me switch over here to Azure Storage Explorer. I'm going to refresh this because I've been working so I can see the latest and greatest data that I put into my storage account. But on the left-hand side, and let me, for those who are not familiar with the Azure side of things, Azure Storage Explorer is a free GUI tool that you can use to manage and work with the data in various Azure storage accounts. I have an Azure storage account here, which you'll probably recognize the name based on the admin settings in Power BI. So this is the storage account that my Power BI tenant is configured to use. Inside it, I have a blob container called Power BI, and it has to be Power BI, no spaces, all lowercase. This is part of the documentation. And if I look, if I look at the permissions that I have set up, and again, there we go, looking around to make sure it shows up on the right screen. So if I look at the permissions that I've set up, you'll notice that there's a set of GUIDs that are here, where these GUIDs are assigned specific permissions inside the Azure Storage account. This is essentially the setup that you need to create when you're preparing your blob container to be used by Power BI, because those GUIDs reference the different service identities that the Power BI service in your tenant will use to write to and read from this storage account. So that's all part of that one-time setup. But if we then jump down into this workspace, remember how I said that there would be one root folder for Power BI and then subfolders for different workspaces? So if I come down here into the folder for the workspace that I've just created, here I see the 3 different folders that each represent one of the data flows that I created inside the workspace. And if I then come down into promotions and calls, I can see that there is both a model.json file. So this is the metadata payload or metadata manifest for all of the entities that are inside this, this data flow. And you'll notice that there is a folder for this calls by account by promotion, which is the entity that I created here. Now, if you think back, you'll maybe saying, let me Alt-Tab here for a second. Let me choose cancel. And where's our close? So you may be saying, now, wait a minute, Matthew, that promotions and calls has 8 entities. So there's only one. Why is there only one showing up in Azure Storage Explorer? Well, remember that 7 of these are linked entities. And if you'll recall, I emphasized that we're not copying data, we're not duplicating it, we're simply referencing it. We only have one entity, this computed entity here, that is actually physically stored in this data flow in its CDM folder. So if I look at this CDM folder, I can say that we have the one folder for the entity. There is a set of snapshots, and the snapshots are managed automatically by the Power BI service to ensure transactional consistency. Remember that this composable ETL will always update the downstream entities in a transactionally consistent manner. This means that regardless of what refreshes are taking place, we need a version of that data that is available for any reader that may be consuming that data, whether or not the current refresh, the transaction of the current refresh will fail or succeed. The data flow logic uses the same, or sorry, the data flows feature uses the same logic as what analysis services would do for managing snapshots of dimensions and measures during a refresh or processing of that tabular model. So it's the same set of concepts and capabilities. But inside, when we drill down from the root storage to the workspace to the data flow to the entity to the snapshots for the entity, here we can see the individual CSV files that contain the data itself that we could then be reading in the data from any other authorized Azure service. But when I come back to this promotions and calls, to the folder that represents our data flow, to this CDM folder, we know that it is a CDM folder because it has a model.json file in that folder. This model.json is the address to the CDM folder. So this is essentially what you connect to in order to understand the full contents of the data flow in the folder itself. So when I look at this, I'm going to get this from the browser instead of from Azure Storage Explorer because it's a little bit easier. When I select the action button for the data flow, either in this diagram view or in the list view, I can say export JSON. It will give me a JSON file through the browser. And let me come over here. I've got VS Code on a different display. So let me grab it. We'll pull this up. Let me do a little bit of pretty formatting to make it easier to read, but you will notice that First of all, it's JSON, which is a format that any modern developer or development tool knows how to read and write. We have basic metadata, including the name, description, last refresh, and so on. There's also some Power BI specific information. So from PBI mashup down through document, this is that full set of metadata and the actual Power Query M query itself that defines all of the entities inside the data flow. And this is something that is unique to Power BI. So if you had a CDM folder that was being created by another application, it wouldn't contain this, this PBI specific set of information. Once we get down below that, we will see that there's going to be a list of all of the entities that are in this data flow. This first one, the one that we created, has a type called local entity. It's another way of saying the data is stored in this CDM folder, and it will have information about its type, about its refresh policy, which you'll notice is another PBI specific things, any annotations, and then the strongly typed attributes to identify this is the name of the column, this is the data type. This is this may just be me as an old ETL guy speaking, but having this type of information that's available rather than simply having a folder full of files, this is gold from a productivity and maturity perspective. And if I scroll further down, you will notice that there are also entries for all of the other 7 entities, but they are typed as reference entities, essentially saying these are entities that are in a different location, and it has a link to where that location is. And if we scroll further down, we can see both where we can find the CDM folders, so the JSON files for those other entities, and we can see, oh, and one of these, all right, so, and apparently, let me scroll to the right here. There we go. So here we've got our model.json snapshots. And for the other entity, if I scroll further back up here, so I'm going to scroll quickly here, you'll notice that for the one entity that is defined in this CDM folder in this data flow, we have a partitions section where this will include that fully qualified path to the file or files that store the data itself. And even though this particular JSON file does not include it, I've got this other one that does. Another section that you will see is information about relationships inside a CDM folder. Power BI, or specifically Power Query Online, if you're pulling data from a relational source that has primary and foreign key relationships defined in it, it will maintain that metadata in the CDM folder using these relationship attributes to say there's a relationship of this type between these attributes in this entity and these attributes in this other entity, so that when you consume this from Power BI Desktop or another client tool that knows how to read this information, it will automatically create and persist this metadata. So this was sort of a quick tour of what those CDM folders contain. I want to come back here and sort of finish off where we started. So I'm going to come in and pick a model.json file from a CDM folder that wasn't one of the ones that I created. I am going to copy the complete path or the complete URL to the JSON file. I'm going to say cancel. And remember that we were here in Power BI and I said create data flow, and we're going to do it by creating and attaching or by attaching an external CDM folder. So I give it a name, I paste in that CDM folder path, and when I choose create and attach, I'll come back here to the list view so it will show up more easily to see. I will now have a brand new data flow, But notice that in addition to the external label, it doesn't have a lot of the same actions and a lot of the same metadata. Because Power BI isn't writing this data, it's simply making it available, we won't have the ability to do things like refresh or investigate the refresh history or the like. But as a consumer, let me actually come back here into Power Query, but as a consumer of that data, if I say new source, more, my poor little laptop is slow today. We'll choose Power BI Data Flows and connect. And if we then look at our workspace, there is this data flow here that, even though I used the word external in the data flow name, as far as any Power BI user is concerned, it's just another data flow. It's just another table of data that they can consume, not realizing that there is, as I jump back, when I'm going to skip a couple things here. I've got many more slides today than we will actually get through. But what the Power BI user doesn't need to recognize is that this CDM folder that defines the data flow that he's then working with in Power BI Desktop, that it was actually written as the output of an Azure machine learning job that was running using data that was pre-processed in Databricks and brought into Azure by Data Factory in the first place. It's this CDM folder as a storage and persistent format, or storage and persistence format, that serves as this magic glue between Azure and Power BI. To emphasize this, the common data model itself is a metadata format. So when we were looking at that JSON file, all of the structures for the metadata and how to describe different things, this is part of the CDM standard that Microsoft has published and is available online on GitHub and in other locations for developers to use. And in addition to CDM as a metadata format, the CDM folders are the storage or persistence format to say, this is how you store and represent data in a CDM compliant format. And because we have this simple, open, interoperable standard way to store data, whether it's Power BI or SQL DW or Azure Databricks or a third-party tool, your code or a vendor's code, any authorized client application can read and write this data. And if we look at, let me come right to the end here. If we look at the basic content or the basic follow-up for where to go next, after this session, I would recommend checking out both the information that we've published on data flows publicly. You may well have done this already, but in the documentation, or as part of the documentation, there is an awesome white paper written by our technical fellow Amir Netz and others on the team. It's probably the single best written resource that I'm aware of for data flows. It's both introductory and goes into some depth. I have blogged extensively on data flows, so when we share the deck afterwards, we will be sharing it on my blog, so we'll have it up there probably early next week. There's also a great deal of information that's available on that common data model, including documentation and an awesome end-to-end sample that starts you with a free Azure trial and walks you through building an end-to-end solution using Data Factory and Databricks and other services using CDM and CDM folders that, if you want to, you can then integrate in with Power BI and see more of that end-to-end scenario. So we are 2 minutes before the end of the hour, so this is, has been a busy, fast hour. So Jason, I didn't leave nearly as much time for Q&A as I promised you I would try to do. We probably have time for a handful of questions. Is there anything that you would like to share?
Yeah, no problem, Matthew. Thank you for the presentation. I guess I'll just go over some quick questions. I guess a lot of some of the features you were showing for the data flow required premium, and I guess someone asked, does the purchase of Data Lake Gen 2 remove the need for premium, or does premium perhaps just cover everything?
So there are two features in data flows that require Power BI premium capacity. One of them is incremental refresh. The other one is linked and computed entities. So using your own Azure storage account is actually unrelated to premium. So if you're using your own Azure storage account, you will still need premium for linked and computed entities, and you'll still need it for incremental refresh, but you won't need it for anything else.
Okay. I guess, well, let me see. There's a lot of questions filing now. If
Well,
someone asked,
let me do this rather than trying to get through everything.
yeah,
If you ask me a question on Twitter, A, I will respond on Twitter, and B, I will use that as a seed for additional blog posts. So if there is a question that we don't get to, feel strongly encouraged to follow up with me on Twitter. Even though I can be noisy sometimes, I do try to have some data flows content there as well.
yeah, that sounds like a better plan. And also, I mean, I'm gonna save the questions logs that everyone just submitted, and I can send that your way as well.
That would
And
be beautiful. I would love to see that.
yeah, and then we can do it that way. All right, Matthew. Thank you so much for the presentation.
All
It
right. Well,
was
thank
very
you
informative.
to you, Jason, and thanks to
Yeah,
everyone else as well.
yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. Hope everyone has a good day and or a good rest of the week. Bye.
Thanks all.